The historian's hands stopped moving the moment I placed the photograph on the table. He had been leafing through a stack of archival documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent decades handling old paper, and had long since stopped being surprised by it. The exhibition hall around us was quiet for a Thursday afternoon, the kind of institutional quiet that belongs to places where history is stored rather than experienced. Display cases lined the walls. Plaques described operations most Americans had never heard of. A few visitors moved slowly between exhibits, reading with the careful attention of people who came to places like this on purpose. I had come on purpose too, though not for the exhibits. I had come because a colleague at my base had mentioned this man's name in passing 6 weeks earlier, describing him as someone who knew more about wartime intelligence operations than anyone still living. And because I had been carrying a question for 3 months that I could not answer on my own. The historian's name was Dr. Walter Pruitt. He was in his early 70s, slight, with the posture of someone who had spent a great deal of his life hunched over documents and had made peace with the consequences. He had agreed to speak with me for 30 minutes about a general research inquiry. He had not asked what the inquiry was. I had not told him. I placed the photograph on the table between us and said nothing. He looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds before his hands went still. Then he leaned forward slowly, the way you lean toward something you are not certain you are seeing correctly. He reached out and touched the edge of the photograph without picking it up, as if he needed to confirm it was real. When he looked up at me, something in his expression had changed completely. It was not alarm. It was not confusion. It was the expression of a man who has spent his career looking for a piece of a puzzle and has just found it in the last place he expected. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My great-grandmother's house," I said. "It was hidden in the wall." He looked at the photograph again, then back at me. Then he said something I was not prepared for. "Do you understand what you are holding?" he asked. "No," I said. "That is why I am here." He sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Cancel whatever you have planned for this afternoon. This is going to take some time." My great-grandfather's name was Edmund Cole. In the family, on the rare occasions he was mentioned at all, he was referred to simply as Edmund, with a particular flatness that attached itself to the name over the generations. The flatness of a subject that had been closed before most of the family had been old enough to ask questions about it. I grew up knowing almost nothing about him except 3 things. He had served in the Second World War. He had died before my grandmother was 5 years old. And he was not, in some unspecified way that no one ever fully explained, someone the family was proud of. I was 31 years old when I found the photograph. By that point, I had spent 8 years as an Air Force officer, had completed 2 overseas assignments, and had developed the kind of relationship with institutional history that military service tends to produce. An awareness that official accounts of events rarely tell the complete story, and that the most significant things are often the ones most carefully omitted. I had applied this awareness to external history without ever quite turning it on my own family. That was perhaps a failure of imagination on my part, or perhaps it was simply easier to let the closed story stay closed. That last part was the one that lodged in me as a child and never quite dislodged itself. Families find ways to honor even their most ordinary dead. They frame photographs and repeat stories and assign virtues to people they barely knew. The fact that Edmund Cole had been actively not discussed, that his name produced a particular quality of silence, rather than the usual softening that comes with time and distance, told me something had happened that the family had decided was better left alone. My grandmother, his daughter, had died when I was 11. She had never spoken to me about her father. My mother, when I was old enough to ask directly, said only that Edmund had done something during the war that embarrassed the family, and that the details were not worth revisiting. I asked what he had done. She said she did not know exactly, only that her own mother had made clear it was not something to be discussed. So I stopped asking. I joined the Air Force at 23, became a pilot, eventually made captain, and carried Edmund Cole as a vague family footnote, a way you carry things that have no clear place to be put down. Then my great-grandmother's house was sold. She had died 2 years earlier at 96, outliving almost everyone who had known her as a young woman, outliving the context that might have explained certain things. The house had sat in a kind of legal and familial limbo since then, various relatives making various claims and counterclaims, until a cousin finally bought out the remaining interests and prepared to sell the property. He gave me a weekend to come and take anything I wanted before the estate clearers arrived on Monday. I drove down on a Saturday morning. The house was in rural Georgia, a 2-story wood frame structure that had been built sometime in the 1920s and had the accumulated weight of a building that had never been significantly renovated. Every room smelled of old wood and the particular mustiness of a house that had been lived in by the same person for 70 years without any of the aggressive modernizing that erases the past. I moved through it methodically, the way I move through anything that requires attention. I was not looking for Edmund specifically. I was looking for anything that seemed worth preserving before it was dispersed or discarded. Most of what I found was ordinary, furniture too heavy to move easily, dishes my great-grandmother had used until recently. Boxes of letters I packed without reading, intending to go through them later. Photographs and frames, mostly of people I recognized. The kitchen had a particular quality of accumulated life that I found difficult to move through quickly. Every drawer contained the evidence of a long and practical existence. Cooking implements worn smooth from decades of use. A small address book with names I did not know crossed out and replaced with other names in different ink. The record of a life that had outlasted most of its contemporaries. A calendar from 1987 still hanging on the inside of a cabinet door, which told me either that she had stopped paying attention to it or that she had kept it for a reason. I took it down and found on the back, in her handwriting, a list of dates with no explanations beside them. Several were in November. One was the date of Edmund's death in 1951. She had been keeping track of something for 36 years after he died, and that particular mystery is one I have since made my peace with not understanding. The bedroom was last. It was a large room with high ceilings and 2 windows that looked out over what had once been a working garden and was now overgrown grass. The closet ran the full length of one wall. I worked through it shelf by shelf. Old clothing, folded with the careful precision of someone raised in an era when fabric was not disposable. Hat boxes. A collection of Reader's Digest volumes going back to the 1950s. At the back of the highest shelf behind the hat boxes, my hand found something that was not a box and not a book. It was flat and hard and slightly irregular at the edges. I brought it down carefully. It was a photograph, unframed, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had been folded and sealed at the edges with what looked like candle wax. Someone had wrapped this with the intention of preserving it. Someone had also placed it at the back of the highest shelf in the deepest closet of the house, which meant that the same person had preserved it and hidden it at the same time. I unwrapped it at the kitchen table. The photograph was black and white, printed on the thick stock of the wartime era. It showed a man in uniform standing in front of what appeared to be a military vehicle, one hand resting on the vehicle's hood, looking at the camera with the neutral expression of someone who is used to being photographed in professional contexts. The uniform was the thing that stopped me. It was German, not ambiguously foreign, not generically European. It was a German military uniform from the Second World War, with the insignia and the cut that I recognized from 100 history books and documentaries. The man wearing it was tall, clean, shaven, with a broad forehead and a straight posture that suggested military training. He looked to be in his mid-30s. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting I did not recognize, were 2 words and a date. The words were in English. They said, "Still alive." The date was March 1943. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The face in the photograph was familiar. Not from memory, not from anything I could immediately place, but from the kind of deep recognition that surfaces when something connects to something else you have been carrying without knowing it. I went back to the box of framed photographs I had already packed, and went through them until I found what I was looking for. There was a small photograph in a plain wooden frame, the kind of photograph that had clearly been moved around a lot, and had the slightly faded quality of an image that had spent time in direct sunlight in several different locations. It showed a man in an American military uniform, younger than the man in the German photograph, but with the same broad forehead, the same straight posture, the same set of the jaw. On the back of the framed photograph, in my great-grandmother's handwriting, were the words, Edmund, 1941. The man in the American uniform and the man in the German uniform were the same person. I drove back to my base on Sunday evening with both photographs in my bag and a kind of stunned quiet in my chest that I did not know what to do with. I did not call my mother. I did not call my cousin. I sat with it for 6 weeks, during which time I researched as much as I could on my own and arrived at a general outline of what might have happened without being able to confirm any of it. Those 6 weeks were some of the more disorienting weeks of my adult life. I was performing my regular duties, flying and briefing and managing the administrative demands of a company, grade officer, while simultaneously spending my off hours in a parallel investigation that felt increasingly significant the deeper I went. I read everything I could find about the OSS, about the specific operational structures that governed DEEP, cover work in Europe about the kinds of people who had been recruited and the fates they had met. Some of what I read was publicly available and well documented. Some of it was the kind of historical speculation that fills in gaps where the records are thin. All of it pointed in the same direction. The man in the German uniform was not a collaborator. He was not a coward. He was not someone who had abandoned his country or his principles for reasons of self-interest or convenience. The available evidence pointed toward exactly the opposite conclusion. And the more I understood about the specific operational context of 1942 and 1943, the more the flatness in the family's voice when they said his name began to sound like the wrong note in a piece of music. The sound of something that had been played incorrectly for so long that everyone had stopped hearing how wrong it was. What I knew about wartime intelligence was professional and current. What I knew about the specific operational history of American intelligence in the Second World War was limited. I needed someone who knew the period in the way that specialists know it. From the inside out, from the archival evidence rather than the popular narrative. That was how I found Dr. Walter Pruitt. He had spent the afternoon clearing his schedule, as he had said he would. We moved from the exhibition hall to a small office in the back of the building, where the walls were covered in maps and shelved documents, and where 2 chairs faced each other across a desk that had clearly never been organized and never needed to be. He made coffee from a machine in the corner and handed me a cup without asking if I wanted one. He studied the photograph for a long time before he spoke. He used a magnifying glass at one point, leaning close over the image with the focused attention of a man confirming something he suspects, but needs to be certain of. Then he set the magnifying glass down and looked at me. "What do you know about the Office of Strategic Services?" he asked. "The predecessor to the CIA," I said. "Wartime intelligence. Established in 1942. He nodded. Within the OSS, he continued, there were several operational divisions. Most people know about the ones that worked in France and Italy, the networks that supported resistance movements, the agents who were inserted behind enemy lines to coordinate sabotage and gather intelligence. Those operations are documented, they have been written about. Some of the people involved became known after the war." He paused. "There were other operations that have not been written about, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that required them to stay hidden permanently. The men and women involved in those operations did not come home to acknowledgement. They came home to silence, in many cases enforced silence, in some cases to the complete erasure of what they had done from any official record." He picked up the photograph again. "Your great-grandfather," he said, "was one of those people." He told me what he knew, which was partial but significant. Edmund Cole had enlisted in the Army in 1940 before the United States entered the war. He had been recruited by OSS in late 1941, identified through a combination of language aptitude, a particular quality of nerve that the selectors looked for, and the specific circumstance that he had spent 2 years working in Germany in the mid-1930s as part of a commercial trade delegation, which meant he spoke fluent German and understood German institutional culture from the inside. Dr. Pruitt explained the selection process with the care of someone who has spent decades thinking about it. The OSS in its early years was drawing from a pool of Americans who had, for various professional reasons, spent time in Europe before the war. Businessmen, academics, journalists, diplomats, people who could move through European society without the particular stiffness of someone for whom the environment was unfamiliar. Edmund Cole had gone to Germany in 1935 as a 27-year-old commercial representative for a Georgia textile company, looking to establish trade relationships with European manufacturers. He had spent 2 years there. He had learned the language with the fluency that comes from full immersion. He had absorbed the way things worked, the bureaucratic rhythms, the social codes, the particular texture of ordinary German professional life in the years before it became something else entirely. That knowledge, acquired for entirely mundane commercial reasons, had made him exactly what the OSS needed in 1942. In the spring of 1942, Edmund Kohl had been inserted into Germany under a false identity. Not as an observer or a courier, or a passive intelligence gatherer. As a functioning officer in the German military bureaucracy, working under a constructed identity that had been built over the preceding months with the specific intention of placing him inside the Wehrmacht, its administrative apparatus. He remained there for 2 years and 4 months. Dr. Pruitt said this last sentence quietly and let it sit for a moment before continuing. 2 years and 4 months, he said again. Inside the German military, with a false identity, under constant risk of discovery, surrounded by people who would have had him executed within hours if they had known what he was, producing intelligence that was transmitted through a chain of cut, out so carefully constructed that even the people receiving it did not know his real name. What kind of intelligence? I asked. Troop movements, he said, supply chain assessments, the internal communications of the planning apparatus, things that informed decisions made at the highest levels of the Allied command without those decision-makers ever knowing where the information originated. I stared at him. My great-grandmother had 2 words written on the back of a photograph of her husband in a German uniform. Still alive. As if the question of whether he was alive had been the primary thing on her mind when the photograph reached her, which it must have been. As if receiving proof that he existed in March of 1943 was itself a form of communication, a message transmitted through channels she was not allowed to understand. He came home, I said, after the war. Yes, Dr. Pruitt said. He came home in late 1945. By that point, the OSS had been formally dissolved, and the men and women who had served in it were in the process of being dispersed, reassigned, or quietly released with instructions about what they were and were not permitted to discuss. Edmund Kohl was released from service in December 1945. He was given a standard discharge, he was told, in the formal language of institutional secrecy, that his service record contained information that would not be available for declassification for a period of not less than 50 years. He was forbidden to discuss what he had done. Not discouraged, not advised against. Forbidden, under the terms of a security agreement he had signed before the operation began. Speaking about the details of his service was a criminal matter. He came home to a wife and a young daughter and a country that was celebrating its victory, and he could not tell any of them what he had spent the war doing. I have tried to imagine what that homecoming was like. The country was in a mood of jubilant relief in 1945, and returning veterans were being celebrated in the particular American way that involves parades and newspaper stories, and the general assumption that service means something visible and accountable. Men were telling their stories. Families were gathering to hear them. The shared experience of the war was being assembled in real time from 1,000 individual accounts, each one adding to the collective understanding of what had happened and why it mattered. Edmund Kohl came home and said nothing. His wife knew, in the general sense that she had known since 1942, that there were things he was not permitted to discuss. She had lived for 3 years with a husband who existed in her life only through the occasional photograph and the knowledge that he was still alive. She had built her understanding of his service around that absence, around the sealed edges of what she was allowed to know. When he came home in the flesh, she had the man but not the explanation, and the security agreement that bound him bound her too, in the practical sense that she could not explain to anyone what there was nothing to explain. So the silence became the family's permanent condition, and silence, when it persists long enough without explanation, generates its own interpretations. I thought about my grandmother, who had grown up not knowing her father, who had died not knowing, who had communicated to her own daughter. My mother, only that Edmund had done something during the war that embarrassed the family, which was what it looked like from the outside. A man who came home from the war and would not talk about it, who seemed, to a family that expected returning veterans to carry their service with some visibility, to be carrying nothing at all. Or worse, to be carrying something he was ashamed of. My grandmother had been 4 years old when the war ended and 5 when her father came home. and she had spent the years between 5 and 13 when he died, in the presence of a man whose silence she was too young to interpret correctly. Children read their parents' emotional states with extraordinary sensitivity but without the context to understand what they mean. She would have sensed the weight her father carried. She would have sensed the particular quality of his withdrawal, the way certain questions produced a careful blankness in him. She would have understood at the level of childhood intuition that there was something she was not supposed to ask about. And when he died before she had grown old enough to ask as an adult, the silence he had maintained became the permanent condition of his absence. There was no later conversation in which he might have explained himself, no deathbed clarity, no letter written for her to find when she was old enough to understand it. He died at 43 and took the explanation with him. And the silence settled into the family as a permanent feature of the landscape, eventually becoming the only version of Edmund Cole that anyone knew. "What killed him?" I asked. Dr. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "The physical cause was a heart attack," he said. "In 1951, he was 43 years old." He looked at me carefully. "There is documentation," he continued, "in sources that have only become available in the last decade, suggesting that the men who served in operations like your great-grandfather experienced a particular kind of psychological aftermath. Not combat trauma in the conventional sense, something more specific to the nature of deep cover work. The sustained pressure of living as someone else completely and without relief for years, the inability to discuss any of it afterward, the requirement to maintain the fiction not just publicly but within their own families." He paused. "Some of them did not manage it well," he said. "The records that exist suggest Edmund Cole was one of those men." I drove back to base that night with the 2 photographs, and a folder of notes, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from a significant rearrangement of something you thought you understood. The road was dark and long, and I did not turn on the radio. I thought about what the family had believed for 70 years. That Edmund Cole had done something shameful during the war. That he was not someone to be proud of, that his name should be spoken with flatness, if at all. I thought about my great-grandmother, who had hidden a photograph in a wall and sealed it with wax and said nothing about it to anyone for the rest of her long life. She had known. She had known what he had done and what it had cost him, and she had been required to keep it the same way he had been required to keep it, living inside a version of events that bore no relationship to the truth. I thought about what it would mean to spend your life knowing that the man you married was a hero and being unable to say so to anyone, including the daughter who grew up believing otherwise. I called my mother the following morning. I told her I needed to come home and show her something. She asked what it was. I said it was about Edmund. There was the particular silence on her end that accompanied the name, the practiced stillness of someone who has long since decided a subject is closed. "It is not what the family thinks," I said. Another silence. "Then, when can you come?" My mother lived in the same town in Georgia where she had grown up, 40 minutes from the house where the photograph had been hidden. She was 61, recently retired from a career in school administration. With the organized manner and careful speech of someone who had spent decades managing other people's problems with professional detachment, she had applied that detachment to the question of Edmund Cole for as long as I could remember. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, which was clean and clear and nothing like Dr. Pruitt's desk, and I placed the 2 photographs between us. She looked at the American photograph first. She had seen it before. I realized from her expression. She had seen it somewhere in her own mother's house and registered it without being told who it was. Then she looked at the German photograph, and her expression changed in a way that was not what I expected. It was not shock. It was something more like the settling of a long confusion, the particular look of someone watching a thing that never made sense suddenly make sense. She had always known something was wrong with the official account. She told me. She had known it the way you know things about your own family that cannot be fully articulated, through the quality of the silences rather than the content of what is said. Her mother had never called Edmund a bad man. She had never expressed anger or betrayal. She had expressed something else, something that my mother had never been able to name, which she now understood was grief. The particular grief of someone mourning a truth they are not permitted to speak. I told her everything Dr. Pruitt had told me, the OSS. The false identity, 2 years and 4 months inside the German military. The intelligence that could not be attributed. The security agreement. The security agreement. The 50-year classification. The heart attack at 43. My mother was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "My mother used to take flowers to his grave every year on his birthday. She never took us. She always went alone. I asked her once why she never brought me and she said it was something she needed to do by herself. I thought she was angry at him." "She was not angry at him," I said. "No," my mother said. "She was not." She looked at the German photograph for a long time. She said, "I told you he had done something embarrassing. I told you that for years. I told your children that. I am sorry. You did not know," I said. "I did not try to know," she replied. "That is different." My mother was right, and I did not argue with her. There is a difference between ignorance and incuriosity, and it is not always a comfortable distinction to draw about yourself. The family had been incurious about Edmund Cole for 70 years. Not maliciously, not out of any particular cruelty. Out of the ordinary human preference for closed subjects over open ones. For manageable versions of the past over complicated ones. We had all, in our various ways, accepted the flatness that attached itself to his name and never pushed on it. Except my great-grandmother, who had wrapped a photograph in oilcloth and sealed it with wax, and placed it at the back of the highest shelf in the deepest closet of her house, and who had lived for 96 years carrying the truth alone. I went back to Dr. Prout 2 weeks later. I had spent the intervening time pursuing what I could through the channels available to me as an Air Force officer with security clearance, and the patience to navigate the particular bureaucracy of declassified military archives. I had found references, partial and heavily redacted, to an operation designated by a codename I will not repeat here, involving the insertion of an American operative into the German military bureaucracy in 1942. The operative was identified in the documents only by a number, but the operational dates matched. The language aptitude profile matched. The discharge date matched. Dr. Prout confirmed what I had found and added what I had not been able to locate. He had spent the 2 weeks since our first meeting going through his own archival sources with Edmund Cole specifically in mind, which I had not asked him to do but which told me something about the kind of historian he was. He had found a post-war assessment, written in 1947 by a senior OSS officer who had overseen Edmund's operation from the American side. The assessment was complimentary in the measured language of official documentation, describing the operative as having performed his function with exceptional stability, under conditions of sustained psychological pressure. It noted that the intelligence produced had directly contributed to the success of 2 significant Allied operations, which were identified by code names that Dr. Prout recognized immediately, and that I looked up later. The assessment also noted, in its final paragraph, that the operative had been returned to civilian life, and that no public recognition of his service was possible, or appropriate given the nature of the operation. It recommended that a classified commendation be placed in the operative's permanent file, and suggested that appropriate measures be taken to ensure the operative's long-term well-being. There was no evidence that any measures had been taken. Edmund Cole had come home to a wife and a daughter and a country celebrating its victory, and a classified commendation in a file that would not be opened for 50 years, and he had been 43 years old when his heart stopped. I asked Dr. Prout what the 2 Allied operations were. He told me their common names rather than their code designations. I knew both of them. Anyone who has studied the European theater of the Second World War knows both of them. They are in the history books as examples of remarkable Allied intelligence superiority at a critical moment. The sources of that intelligence are not specified in the history books. One of those sources was a tall man with a broad forehead standing in front of a German military vehicle in March of 1943, sending a photograph back to his wife so she would know he was still alive. I did not have a specific plan for what came next. I knew I wanted the family to understand what Edmund Cole had actually been. I knew I wanted it on record somewhere, in whatever form records are possible for things that were intentionally kept off the record. Beyond that, I was operating on instinct rather than strategy. Dr. Prout, as it turned out, had a suggestion. There was, he told me, a small community of historians and archivists who worked specifically on the recovery of wartime intelligence history, people who understood both the research methodology and the institutional processes that governed what could and could not be formally acknowledged. He knew people in this community who had successfully navigated the process of securing posthumous recognition for OSS operatives whose service had been classified for decades. It was not a simple process. It was not guaranteed. But it was not impossible. He offered to make introductions. I said yes. The process took 8 months. I will not describe all of it here because most of it was paperwork and waiting, and the particular patience required to move anything through government bureaucracy, which is a skill the Air Force teaches you in ways both formal and informal. There were forms I was not expecting and requests for documentation I had to locate through channels. I had to identify and contacts I had to cultivate from scratch. There were months when nothing appeared to be happening and the process seemed to have stopped entirely. And then there were days when 3 things moved at once. Dr. Pruitt was invaluable throughout, not only for his archival knowledge but for his familiarity with the specific bureaucratic geography of this particular kind of historical work. He had done it before. He knew which walls were real, and which ones just looked like walls. There was a moment, about 4 months in, when it appeared that the relevant files might be more heavily redacted than anticipated, and that the formal recognition might not be possible in the form we had hoped for. Dr. Pruitt wrote a letter to the appropriate office that I was not permitted to read, but that he told me was a thorough and unambiguous argument for the historical significance of the operation, and the personal cost to the operative and his family. 2 weeks later, the process resumed. I mention this not to dramatize the bureaucratic dimension, but because it is part of the truth of what recovery like this requires. It is not only an emotional journey, it is a logistical one. It requires patience and persistence, and the willingness to keep pushing on something when the institutional inertia pushes back. Not everyone has the resources or the access to do what I was able to do for Edmund Cole. I was an Air Force officer with security clearance and a network, and the kind of professional credibility that opens doors in government offices. Most families searching for this kind of truth do not have those advantages. That is an injustice I think about. It was a commendation. Edmund Cole's full name was on it, his rank, his service dates. A description of his operation that was still partially redacted, but that contained enough to make clear what he had done and why it had mattered. And at the bottom, a formal notation that the commendation had been classified at the time of issuance and was now being released as part of the systematic declassification of OSS personnel records. Dr. Hale told me that in her years doing this work, she had processed the records of approximately 60 operatives whose service had been similarly classified. In most of those cases, she said, the families had been entirely unaware of what their relative had done. In some cases, she added, the families had believed something actively incorrect about the person, something worse than the truth, because the silence around the real story had allowed other stories to fill the space. I told her that was exactly what had happened with Edmund Cole. She nodded as if this was not surprising. We do what we can, she said. It is not enough, but it is something. I brought the commendation home to my mother on a Friday afternoon in late autumn. My cousin was there, the one who had sold the house, 2 aunts who were old enough to have known their grandmother, and to carry their own versions of the Edmund Cole story. My mother had told them I was coming and that there was something they needed to hear, and they had come with the careful wariness of family members summoned for news that might be difficult. I placed the original photographs on the table. The American one, the German one, then I placed the commendation beside them. I told the story from the beginning, the house, the closet, the oilcloth and the wax. Dr. Pruitt and the exhibition hall, the OSS and the false identity and the 2 years and 4 months inside the German military. The intelligence that had contributed to operations they would recognize if I named them. The security agreement and the classified file and the heart attack at 43. The commendation that had sat in a locked file for 78 years. One of my aunts, who was the oldest person in the room and had actually known my great-grandmother as an adult rather than only as a child, began crying before I was halfway through. Not quietly, the full-throated crying of someone releasing something that has been compressed for a very long time. She said, I always felt there was something she was not saying. I used to push her. I used to ask her directly about Edmund and she would close her face in a particular way and I thought she was protecting herself from grief. I did not understand she was protecting something else. She told me, through the crying, that she had made assumptions about Edmund Cole when she was young that she had never revisited. She had heard the family consensus and accepted it as truth because there was nothing visible to contradict it. He was not discussed with pride. He had died young. He had apparently left no legacy worth cataloging. She had slotted him into the category of family members who were sad rather than admirable, who were mourned in a muted way rather than honored. Now she was looking at a commendation with his name on it and a description of what he had done, and the category she had built for him over 60 years was insufficient to hold it. My cousin sat very still through all of it. He was a practical man, not given to demonstrative emotion, but when I finished he looked at the German photograph for a long time and said, "I sold that house. I cleared out most of what was in it." If you had not come that weekend, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. My mother spoke last. She said she had spent 40 years carrying a version of her grandfather that she now understood was not only incomplete but actively inverted. She had believed he was a source of shame. She had transmitted that belief to her children. She had let it stand for decades because it was easier to accept a closed story than to push against one. She looked at the commendation. She said, "My mother knew the truth and could not say it. She lived with that for 50 years. She went to his grave alone every year on his birthday because that was the one place she could be honest about who he was. The room was quiet for a long time after that." Eventually, my cousin asked a question that the others had been circling without asking directly. He said, "What do we do with this now?" It was a good question. The commendation was real and official, but it had come to us 78 years after it was written, long after the people most immediately affected were gone. Edmund Cole would not know about it. My great-grandmother would not know about it. My grandmother would not know about it. My grandmother, his daughter, who had grown up without a father and without an explanation, would not know about it. I had thought about this, and I had an answer, though. It was not a complete one. "We remember it accurately," I said. "We stopped telling the wrong story. We tell the right one." That was not nothing. It was in fact more than it sounds. Families carry their narratives in ways that shape how they understand themselves and each other. The narrative the Cole family had carried about Edmund for 70 years had shaped how my grandmother understood her father, how my mother understood her grandfather, how I had grown up with a vague sense of family shame attached to a name I barely knew. Replacing that narrative with the true one would not undo any of that. But it would change what was passed forward. My cousin, who had sold the house and had been sitting quietly since I finished speaking, asked if we should consider some form of public recognition. A memorial, perhaps, or a marker at the cemetery. I said that was the family's decision to make together, and that whatever form it took, it should reflect what Edmund Cole himself had been, which was a man who had performed extraordinary service and wanted no credit for it. I did not think a large public marker was what he would have chosen. I thought something quieter was more appropriate. We settled on adding his full service history to the family records, replacing the flat notation that had stood there for decades. And on a stone at the cemetery, below his name and his dates, 4 words that had never been there before. He served in silence. Dr. Prudick connected me with a journalist who wrote about wartime intelligence history. I agreed to speak with her on the record, with the understanding that she would verify what she could through the archival record before publishing anything. The resulting piece was not long, not prominent, a specialized publication with a small readership, but it named Edmund Cole. It described what he had done. It used the word that his family had been unable to use for 78 years, hero. My mother framed a copy and hung it beside the photograph from 1941, the American one, with Edmund in his uniform looking at the camera with the neutral expression of a man who has not yet been told what he will be asked to do. I kept the German photograph. I look at it sometimes, usually late in the evening when the work of the day has settled, and there is space for the kind of thinking that does not fit into scheduled hours. I look at the man standing in front of the military vehicle in March of 1943, in a uniform that was not his, in a country that would have killed him if it had known who he was, looking at the camera with the same neutral expression, knowing that somewhere across a chain of intermediaries and cut-outs and carefully constructed anonymity, a woman in Georgia was going to see this photograph and know that he was still alive. That was what she needed to know. Not that he was safe, not that the work was going well, not that he would be home soon, just that he existed. Just that the specific human being she had married was still in the world. He sent her a photograph from inside Germany to tell her he was still alive. She wrapped it in oilcloth and sealed it with wax and hid it behind the hat boxes on the highest shelf of the deepest closet and never showed it to anyone for 50. 3 years until the year she died at 96. At which point she had perhaps forgotten it was there, or perhaps decided, in the way of very old people who have been carrying things for a very long time, that she had done what she could and the rest was for someone else to find. I think about that decision sometimes. The decision to hide it rather than destroy it. She could have burned the photograph. She could have removed the only physical evidence that Edmund Cole had ever existed inside a German uniform. No one would have known. No one would have come asking questions 70 years later. The story would have remained what it was, closed and flat and final. She did not burn it. I have asked myself why many times since that afternoon in Dr. Prutt's office. The practical answer is that she could not bring herself to destroy the last image of her husband from the years of his most significant work. Even if that image was one she could never show anyone, the photograph was proof of something that had no other proof, and destroying proof feels different from simply keeping a secret. Keeping a secret is passive. Destroying evidence is active, even in a cause that was entirely justified. Even to protect a man she loved from misunderstanding, she was not able to make that active choice. But I think there was something else. I think she hid it because she was keeping faith with a possibility. The possibility that someday the classification would lift, that the records would open, that someone would come looking with the right questions and the right credentials and the patience to sit with an old woman and ask her what she knew. She may have imagined a scenario where she could finally say, "Here is what he did. Here is the proof. Here is what I have been carrying alone for 50 years. That scenario did not arrive in time for her, but the proof she preserved made it possible for someone else. I think she hid it because she could not destroy the last proof that her husband had been, in the most fundamental sense, exactly who she had always known him to be. The oilcloth and the wax were not the precautions of someone hiding something shameful. They were the precautions of someone preserving something precious. She preserved it in the only way available to her and put it somewhere safe and trusted, in the way that people who have no other choice trust that the right person would eventually find it. I found it. I am a military officer. I served because I believed in service, which I still do, and because I grew up near the idea of service, in the shadow of a family history I did not fully understand. I understand it better now, not completely. There are things about Edmund Cole that I will never know. Things that died with him at 43 and with my great-grandmother at 96 and with my grandmother somewhere in between. The archival record is partial. The human record is gone. But I know enough. I know that he went where he was sent and did what he was asked, and maintained his cover for 2 years and 4 months under conditions that most people cannot meaningfully imagine. I know that the intelligence he produced contributed to the success of operations that changed the course of the war in ways that are still being studied. I know that he came home and said nothing about any of it and was dead 6 years later, and that the family he left behind lived for decades in a version of his story that was the opposite of the truth. I know that my great-grandmother knew the truth and carried it alone for 50 years and never put it down. I know something else now too, which I have arrived at slowly over the years since I found the photograph. I know that the story of Edmund Cole is not primarily a story about heroism, though it is that. It is a story about what happens when the full truth of a person's life is withheld from the people who love them, not through malice but through institutional necessity, and what accumulates in the space where the truth should be. It is a story about the particular damage done when silence, maintained for legitimate reasons, gets misread as absence of content rather than suppression of it. The family did not know Edmund Cole was a hero, but they also did not know they did not know. They thought they had the complete picture. They thought the flatness of his name was the flatness of his life. That is the wound I think about most. Not the unfairness to Edmund Cole himself, though that is real. The wound to the family's understanding of who they came from. My grandmother grew up believing her father was someone who had not quite managed. My mother grew up carrying that belief as inherited truth. I grew up with a vague inherited shame about a name I had never been given reason to examine. 3 generations of misunderstanding, compounding. Never challenged because there was no visible evidence that it was wrong. Until there was. The photograph in the oilcloth was the visible evidence. My great-grandmother put it there because she could not destroy the last proof of what her husband had actually done, and because some part of her, perhaps conscious and perhaps not, believed that proof should survive her even if she could not speak it. She trusted the house to hold it. She trusted time to eventually make the question askable. She trusted that someone would eventually find it and know what to do. I found it. I knew what to do. I am not certain I would have, 10 years earlier before the Air Force and the overseas assignments, and the accumulated education in what institutional silence looks like from the inside. I am not certain the right person would have found it at all, given a different set of circumstances. The photograph could easily have ended up in a box taken to a donation center or in a garbage bag set out before I arrived. My great-grandmother trusted a great deal to chance and patience and the particular stubbornness of oilcloth and wax. It held. 3 years in a closet and it held. There is a kind of service that does not come with ceremony. It does not come with recognition or commendation or the particular public acknowledgement that tells a person, and the people around them, that what they did mattered. It comes with a classified file and a security agreement, and instructions about what cannot be said, and then it comes with silence. Sometimes for decades, sometimes permanently. The men and women who perform that kind of service do not stop performing it when the formal assignment ends. They perform it for the rest of their lives in every conversation they do not have, every question they deflect, every moment they sit across from their families and say nothing about the most significant thing they have ever done. Edmund Cole performed that service for 6 years, until his heart gave out. What strikes me most, when I allow myself to sit with the full weight of it, is not the heroism of what he did inside Germany. It is the sustained heroism of what he did afterward. Going into a cover identity for 2 years requires nerve and training, and the particular psychological architecture of someone who can sustain a lie under pressure for an extended period. Coming home and maintaining silence for the rest of your life, in the face of family misunderstanding and social isolation, and the accumulated frustration of being known incorrectly, requires something harder to name. It requires a commitment to a promise that no one around you is in a position to appreciate or acknowledge. It requires being willing to be misunderstood indefinitely, for a reason you cannot explain, in service of something that has already been completed. That is a different kind of courage than the kind that gets commemorated. It is quieter and less visible, and it asks more of a person over a longer period. I am not sure the commendation, justified and important as it is, fully accounts for it. I do not know if he was at peace with it. I do not know if the terms he had agreed to felt reasonable to him in 1945. When the war was over and the work was done, and all that remained was the permanent silence. I do not know what it cost him specifically, to live inside that silence with the people who loved him and who deserved a real account of who he was. I know that he wore his American uniform in 1941 and his German uniform in 1943. And that both were in service of the same thing, which was the survival of a world his daughter and her children and their children would grow up in. I know that he never asked any of us to understand this because he was never permitted to explain it. The commendation is in a frame on my mother's wall. The German photograph is in a folder on my desk. The family no longer speaks Edmund Cole's name with flatness. We speak it the way you speak the name of someone you are still in the process of coming to know, with the particular care that attaches to things that were almost lost and were not. My mother drives to the cemetery on his birthday now. She takes flowers the way my great-grandmother did. She does not go alone. My cousin, who sold the house, has become unexpectedly interested in family history. He contacted me last spring to say he had started going through the boxes of letters I had packed and had found several that appeared to be from my great-grandmother to Edmund during the war, addressed to a postal forwarding address that she would not have known was a cut out in the OSS communication chain. The letters were carefully ordinary, full of domestic news and the small events of a Georgia town in wartime, and they were clearly written by someone who understood that anything she said might be read by people other than her husband. But at the close of each one, after the standard sign-off, she had added a single line that was not ordinary at all. She had written, "I know who you are." Different words each time, but always some version of the same message. I know who you are. I have not forgotten. Whatever they are telling you about yourself over there, I know the truth of it. She was writing to a man living inside a false identity, reminding him, letter by letter, that she held the real one. That somewhere in Georgia there was a person who knew his actual name and his actual character, and was keeping that knowledge safe for whenever he came back to claim it. He came back. And then he could not tell her that she had been the thing that made it possible, because the same agreement that silenced everything else silenced that too. I think about those letters when I think about what it means to hold someone as truth for them. My great-grandmother held Edmund Cole's truth for 50 years in her memory and for 53 in that closet. She could not speak it, she could not share it. She could only keep it faithfully and completely, until someone came who could do something with it. We did something with it. It was not enough, and it was not nothing. That is the honest accounting. I think about the people in every family who are being misremembered right now, not the people who have been forgotten, though there are plenty of those. The ones who are actively present in the family narrative, but in a version that does not match what they actually were. The ones whose silence was read as absence, whose stillness was read as emptiness, whose inability to explain themselves was read as having nothing worth explaining. They are in most families, usually older. Usually people who came of age in eras when certain things were not discussed, when service meant doing the thing and not talking about it. When the psychological costs of extraordinary experience were not acknowledged as costs at all, but simply as the condition of adulthood. They did not leave us nothing. They left us themselves, imperfectly visible, partially legible, waiting for someone to look carefully enough and long enough to read what was actually there. The photograph in the oilcloth was there for 53 years. I am glad I went back to the house that weekend. I am glad I checked the highest shelf. I am glad I did not throw away a piece of old oilcloth without unwrapping it first. I am glad my great-grandmother did not burn the photograph. If you have someone in your family whose story does not quite add up, whose silence has been mistaken for emptiness, whose name carries a flatness that was never properly explained, do not let that stand. Ask the questions. Look in the closets. Find the people who know the parts that were kept from you. It is almost never too late to understand someone better. And it is never without value. The closets of old houses hold more than people expect. Not always photographs wrapped in oilcloth. Not always something with a dramatic explanation waiting at the end of an 8-month process. Sometimes just a calendar with a column of unexplained dates. Sometimes just a letter written in careful ordinary language that contains, if you read it closely enough, a sentence that does not quite belong to the ordinary register of everything around it. Sometimes just the way a person closed their face when a particular name came up, which tells you that the name meant something they had decided not to say. Pay attention to those things. Follow them when you can. Ask the question before there is no one left who can answer it. Because the truth about the people we came from is also the truth about who we are, and we deserve to know it. And so do they. The least we can do for the people who carried things silently for our sake is to finally, when the time comes and the records open and the stories can be spoken, say their names correctly. Edmund Cole, Army, Office of Strategic Services, 2 years and 4 months inside the German military during the Second World War. Intelligence that contributed to the success of operations that helped end that war. A classified commendation filed in 1946 and declassified in 2023. A Georgia woman who wrote him letters during the war reminding him that she knew who he really was. A heart that stopped at 43 before he could explain any of it. A family that misunderstood him for 70 years and understands him now. Thank you for listening.